Princess Hana stepped through the gleaming doorway of the neutral space station, her pale blue robes flowing behind her like water. The Whisper Realm had sent their most promising diplomat, though Hana herself wondered if that was truly wise. Her hands trembled slightly as she gazed around the sterile meeting chamber with its cold metal walls and harsh artificial lighting. Everything here felt so different from her homeworld's soft crystal towers and gentle floating gardens. Back on her planet, conversations happened through delicate mental touches, like butterflies landing on flower petals. Emotions were shared as quietly as morning mist. But here, in this alien place, she would have to use her voice and face creatures who communicated in ways that seemed impossibly loud and direct to her sensitive mind. The chamber doors hissed open with a sharp sound that made Hana flinch. Heavy footsteps echoed across the floor, each one hitting the ground with purpose and determination. She looked up to see a human male striding toward her with the confidence of someone who had never doubted himself in his entire life. This had to be Captain June, the human representative she had heard so much about. June wore a dark military uniform decorated with colorful ribbons and medals that caught the harsh station lighting. But what drew Hana's attention were the scars that marked his face and hands. 3 parallel lines ran down his left cheek, while a jagged mark crossed his forehead. These were clearly battle wounds, evidence of violence and conflict that her peaceful species had never known. As he approached, Hana felt her telepathic abilities react to his presence like a flower suddenly exposed to blazing sunlight. His mind radiated intensity and strength in waves that crashed against her delicate psychic senses. She tried to build her usual mental barriers to protect herself, but his sheer presence seemed to overwhelm every defense she attempted to construct. The buoy captain stopped a respectful distance away and offered what humans called a smile. On his scarred face, the expression looked both fierce and oddly gentle at the same time. He began to speak in the common galactic language, his voice deep and commanding, even when he was clearly trying to be polite. Princess Hana, welcome to Station Harmony. I am Captain June of the Terran Defense Forces. We appreciate your people agreeing to these peace negotiations. Hana opened her mouth to respond with the formal diplomatic greeting she had practiced hundreds of times, but her telepathic abilities, already destabilized by his overwhelming presence, suddenly went completely haywire. Instead of keeping her thoughts private as she had been trained to do since childhood, her mind began broadcasting every nervous reaction directly into his head. The thoughts poured out of her like water from a broken dam. How strange it was that humans wore their battle scars like decorations. How his damaged face was somehow more interesting to look at than the unmarked features of her own people. How the confident way he moved made something flutter strangely in her chest, even though she knew she should be afraid of such a clearly dangerous warrior. June's confident expression suddenly shifted to one of surprise and confusion. His dark eyes widened as her uncontrolled thoughts continued flooding into his mind. She could see the exact moment when he realized what was happening, when he understood that this nervous alien princess was accidentally sharing every embarrassing thought she was having about him. Hana's face turned the deep purple color that indicated extreme embarrassment in her species. She pressed her hands against her temples, desperately trying to stop the mental broadcasting, but her powers remained completely beyond her control. The formal negotiations began an hour later in the station's main conference room. Hana sat across from Captain June at a polished metal table, with various alien diplomats filling the other seats. The room buzzed with the quiet hum of translation devices and the soft rustling of official documents. June leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table as he began outlining humanity's position on the territorial disputes. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. Each word hit Hana's sensitive mind like a hammer striking an anvil. Our colonies in the Outer Rim require immediate protection, June stated firmly. The pirate attacks have increased by 40% in the last 6 months. We need guaranteed safe passage through your people's space to provide adequate defense. The directness of his speech sent waves of discomfort through Hana's psychic receptors. Back home, such important matters would be discussed through gentle mental sharing, with emotions and intentions flowing like a calm river between minds. But June's communication style felt like standing in a thunderstorm, with each sentence crackling through the air like lightning. When the other diplomats turned to her for the Whisper Realm's response, Hannah tried to speak. She had prepared her words carefully, practicing the formal phrases that would convey her people's concerns about military vessels passing through their peaceful territories. But when she opened her mouth, only the faintest whisper emerged. We understand your concerns, she managed, her voice so quiet that the translation devices barely picked it up. But our people have lived in harmony for centuries without... Her words trailed off as June's intense gaze focused on her. His dark eyes seemed to look right through her, and she could feel his impatience radiating across the table like heat from a fire. The other diplomats leaned forward, straining to hear her soft voice, which only made her more nervous. June noticed her distress immediately, the way her delicate hands shook slightly as she reached for her water glass. How her already pale complexion seemed to grow even lighter, the manner in which she kept glancing toward the door as if considering escape. "Perhaps we could take a brief recess," he suggested, his voice dropping to what he thought was a gentler tone. But even his attempt at speaking softly still carried the commanding edge of a military officer. During the break, June approached Hannah carefully, like someone trying not to startle a nervous animal. He pulled out a chair and sat down at what he considered a respectful distance, which was still much closer than anyone from her culture would normally sit. "Princess, I can... See, this is difficult for you," he said, genuinely trying to help. "Maybe we could find a way to make this easier. Would you prefer if I spoke more quietly?" His well-intentioned offer only highlighted the vast gap between their cultures. Hannah's people didn't just communicate quietly in terms of volume. Their entire approach to sharing information was fundamentally different. They valued subtlety, indirect suggestion, and emotional harmony above all else. "It's not just the volume," Hannah whispered, struggling to explain something that seemed impossible to put into words. "Your thoughts are so solid, so definite. When you speak, it's like you're completely certain about everything." June looked puzzled. In his world, confidence and certainty were valuable leadership qualities. The idea that his directness could be overwhelming had never occurred to him. "Isn't being sure about things good?" he asked honestly. "How can we solve problems if we're not clear about what needs to be done?" The peace talks had been going on for 3 days when everything went wrong. Hannah was finally starting to feel slightly more comfortable around Captain June, though she still spoke in whispers and jumped whenever he moved too quickly. They had found a rhythm of sorts, with him speaking more softly and giving her time to gather her thoughts before responding. On that morning, delegates from 12 different species had gathered in the station's Grand Assembly Hall for what was supposed to be the signing ceremony. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, representing each world involved in the negotiations. The air hummed with excitement and hope, as beings who had been enemies for decades prepared to make peace. Hannah stood near the podium, wearing formal ceremonial robes of shimmering silver that caught the light as she moved. June was positioned across the room with the other military representatives, but she could feel his steady presence like a warm fire on a cold night. Over the past few days, she had grown strangely comforted by his mental strength, even though it still overwhelmed her sometimes. The first explosion came without warning. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the ventilation system above the main entrance, followed immediately by a deafening boom that shook the entire station. Smoke began pouring into the hall as emergency alarms started blaring. Delegates screamed and rushed toward the exits in panic, their careful diplomatic composure forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Hannah stood frozen in terror as chaos erupted around her. Her sensitive mind was suddenly flooded with the fear and panic of hundreds of beings, their emotions crashing into her consciousness like waves against rocks. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe as the overwhelming flood of terror paralyzed her completely. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw figures in dark clothing moving with military precision. These weren't random attackers. They were organized, disciplined, and heading straight for the podium where she stood helpless. Captain June saw the danger before anyone else did. Years of combat experience had trained him to spot threats in the middle of chaos. He watched the dark figures advancing on Hana's position and realized instantly that this wasn't just a general attack. Someone was specifically targeting the Whisper Realm's princess. Without hesitation, June sprinted across the hall, pushing through panicking delegates and jumping over fallen debris. His military training kicked in automatically as he calculated angles and distances. He could see another explosive device. Being prepared, its red lights blinking ominously as the attackers aimed it directly at Hana. "Get down," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the noise and confusion. The second explosion was much closer than the first. Jun reached Hana just as the device detonated, throwing himself across her body and wrapping his arms around her as they both crashed to the floor. The blast wave hit them like a physical blow, and debris rained down from the damaged ceiling. In that moment of impact, something extraordinary happened. As Jun's mind focused entirely on protecting Hana, and her terrified consciousness reached out desperately for any source of strength, their thoughts suddenly collided and merged. The physical contact, combined with their intense emotions, created a bridge between their minds that neither species had ever experienced before. For a few seconds, Hana felt what it was like to be completely unafraid. She experienced Jun's calm, determination, his automatic assessment of threats, and his absolute certainty that he would protect her no matter what it cost him. At the same time, Jun was flooded with her overwhelming sensitivity, feeling how every emotion in the room hit her like physical pain, and understanding for the first time why she seemed so fragile when the rescue teams found them 20 minutes. Later, both were unconscious and had to be rushed to the medical bay. Hana woke up in the medical bay 3 hours later with the strangest sensation she had ever experienced. Usually, when she opened her eyes, her mind felt like a quiet lake at dawn, peaceful and still. But now there was something else there, like a second voice humming softly in the background of her thoughts. She sat up carefully on the narrow medical bed, her head still spinning from the explosion. Across the room, Captain Jun was lying on another bed, his eyes closed but his breathing steady. The doctors had cleaned and bandaged several cuts on his face and arms, but he had taken the worst of the blast to protect her. As she watched him sleep, images began flowing through her mind that definitely weren't her own memories. She saw a small garden behind a simple house, with carefully tended roses and tomatoes growing in neat rows. She felt the satisfaction of soil between fingers and the peaceful rhythm of watering plants in the early morning light. Then came words, beautiful words arranged in patterns that made her heart race. Poetry about starlight and distant worlds, about the loneliness of command and the weight of responsibility. These weren't the thoughts of a simple soldier. This was the inner world of someone who found beauty in unexpected places and carried deep feelings he never showed to anyone. Jun's eyes opened suddenly, and he looked directly at her with an expression of wonder and confusion. "You're terrified of crowds," he said softly, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Not just nervous or uncomfortable, actually terrified, like someone afraid of drowning. Hana nodded slowly, surprised that he understood so completely. "And you grow roses," she whispered back. "You have a whole garden at home, and you write poetry about the stars." They stared at each other for a long moment, both realizing that the explosion had created something unprecedented between them. Their minds were still connected, sharing thoughts and feelings in ways that neither of their species had ever experienced. "This is impossible," Jun said, sitting up and running a hand through his dark hair. "Humans aren't telepathic. We can't. Do what you people do. Neither can my people," Hana replied, her voice stronger than usual. "We've never been able to maintain a connection with non-telepathic species, but somehow we're still linked." Over the next few hours, they discovered the extent of their strange bond. Hana could feel Jun's tactical mind working through problems, his systematic approach to analyzing threats and planning responses. Meanwhile, Jun experienced her incredible ability to sense emotions and detect the subtle cues that revealed when someone was lying or hiding something. When Station Security Chief Ko arrived to interview them about the attack, they realized their combined abilities could be incredibly useful. As the security chief asked questions about what they had seen, Hana could sense his frustration and genuine concern for their safety. But when he mentioned that they had already identified the attackers as members of a radical peace movement, she felt a spike of deception. "He's lying," she whispered to June through their mental link. "Not about wanting to help us, but about who was responsible." June's military training kicked in immediately. "The attack was too coordinated," he responded silently. "Professional. Soldiers, not political extremists. Someone with access to the station's layout planned this. Working together, they began to piece together the real truth." Hana's empathic abilities could detect lies and hidden emotions, while June's tactical experience helped identify the professional nature of the attack. They realized that someone in a position of authority was working to sabotage the peace negotiations, and they were probably the only ones who could figure out who. "We need to investigate this ourselves," June said aloud after the security chief left. "If we're right, we can't trust anyone in an official position." Hana felt a surge of determination that was part her own and part borrowed from June's unwavering resolve. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of taking action. Over the following week, Hana and June spent almost every waking moment together, investigating the attack while pretending to recover from their injuries. What started as a partnership born from necessity slowly transformed into something deeper and more meaningful. June made small changes that Hana noticed immediately. Instead of his usual heavy military boots, he wore soft-soled shoes that made barely any sound as he walked. He stopped gesturing with his hands when he talked, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Most importantly, he began speaking in a gentler tone, his voice losing that commanding edge that had once overwhelmed her sensitive mind. "I never realized how loud I was," he admitted one evening as they sat in the station's observation deck, watching stars drift past the massive windows. "My whole life people told me that speaking with authority was important for leadership. I never thought about how it might affect someone like you." Hana found herself responding more naturally than she ever had before. "On my world, we believe that the quietest voice often carries the most wisdom," she said, her words coming easily instead of in whispered fragments. "But watching you work, I'm starting to understand that sometimes problems need strong action, not just gentle consideration." Their mental link had evolved too. What began as an accidental connection was becoming a conscious partnership. Hana could share her empathic readings with June instantly, while he could show her tactical assessments and strategic thinking. They were becoming something entirely new, a hybrid of human determination and alien sensitivity. The investigation was revealing disturbing truths. Using Hana's ability to detect deception and June's skill at reading people's behavior, they discovered that the conspiracy reached much higher than anyone suspected. 3 different species representatives were involved, all working together to ensure the peace talks failed. "They want the war to continue," June explained as they reviewed their findings in Hana's quarters. "The weapons manufacturers, the military contractors, the shipping companies that profit from conflict. Peace threatens their entire business model." Hana felt sick as she processed the emotional residue left behind by their suspects. "I can sense their greed," she said, pressing her hand to her forehead. "It's like a poison that's infected their thinking. They actually believe that keeping people afraid and angry is worth the suffering it causes." What made their partnership so effective was how their different strengths complemented each other. When they interviewed potential witnesses, June's commanding presence encouraged people to take their questions seriously, while Hana's gentle demeanor made them feel safe enough to share sensitive information. During one crucial conversation, with a maintenance worker who had seen suspicious activity before the attack, Hana detected fear and honesty in the aliens' emotions, while June recognized the tactical significance of what they were being told. Someone with high-level access. Codes was downloading station blueprints, the worker had whispered nervously. They knew exactly where to place those explosives for maximum damage. As they spent more time together, both began to change in fundamental ways. Hana discovered that she could be brave when she had June's strength to draw upon, while he learned that careful observation and patience often achieved more than direct confrontation. "You know what's strange?" Hana said one night as they worked late in the station's archives. cross-referencing access logs with personnel records. I'm not afraid anymore. Not of speaking up, not of being noticed, not even of making mistakes. Jun looked up from his datapad, a small smile crossing his scarred face. And I'm learning that taking time to really understand a situation works better than just charging ahead with the first plan that comes to mind. Their investigation was nearing its conclusion, but both realized they had found something far more valuable than just the truth about the conspiracy. They had discovered that two completely different ways of being could work together perfectly. The second attack came just as Hana and June were preparing to present their evidence about the conspiracy. Emergency alarms began screaming throughout the station at exactly 0300 hours, when most beings were deep in sleep. This time the attackers weren't targeting the diplomatic areas. They were going after the civilian sections where families and non-military personnel lived. Hana woke instantly as explosions rocked the residential decks. Through her mental link with June, she felt his combat instincts activate immediately, his mind shifting into the focused state she had come to recognize as his battle mode. "They're hitting the family quarters," June said grimly, already pulling on his uniform and checking his weapon. "This isn't about stopping the peace talks anymore. They want to create maximum casualties to turn public opinion against any cooperation between species." Through the station's communication system, panicked, voices filled the air in dozens of different languages. Parents calling for children, elderly beings unable to move quickly, confusion and terror spreading like wildfire through the civilian population. Hana felt the familiar paralysis beginning to creep over her as waves of fear from thousands of minds crashed into her consciousness. But this time, instead of shutting down completely, she felt June's steady strength flowing through their bond. "I have to go fight them," June said, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "But Hana, these people need coordination. The evacuation routes are chaotic, and people are getting separated from their families. Your telepathic abilities could save thousands of lives." The thought of reaching out to so many minds at once terrified her more than anything she had ever faced. Back home, she had only communicated with a few people at a time, usually family members or close friends. The idea of connecting with thousands of strangers, all of them panicking and afraid, felt impossible. "I can't," she whispered, her old fears rushing back. "There are too many. Their emotions will overwhelm me. I'll lose myself in all that terror and confusion." June knelt down beside her, his dark eyes serious but gentle. "You're not the same person who arrived here 2 weeks ago," he said quietly. "You've been speaking up in meetings, making decisions, leading this investigation. You're stronger than, you know." Through their mental connection, he shared his absolute faith in her abilities. She felt his certainty that she could do this, his complete trust in her strength. More importantly, she felt his promise that he would anchor her, providing a mental lifeline she could follow back to herself, no matter how far she had to extend her consciousness. Taking a deep breath that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, Hana closed her eyes and began to extend her telepathic awareness. At first, the flood of panicked thoughts nearly knocked her unconscious. Thousands of minds crying out in fear, confusion, and desperation crashed into her consciousness, like a tsunami. But instead of being swept away, she held on to the steady presence of June's mind like an anchor in a storm. Using their connection as her foundation, she began to organize the chaos. Attention all telepathic beings, she broadcast across multiple mental frequencies. "This is Princess Hana of the Whisper Realm. I need your help to coordinate evacuation efforts." Within minutes, she had established a network of dozens of telepaths from various species, each one serving as a relay point for her instructions. Through this network, she could reach every section of the station simultaneously. "Families in Section C, move to emergency exit 7, she directed, her mental voice calm and authoritative despite her racing heart. "Medical personnel, there are injured beings in the main corridor near the lift systems. Parents looking for children, check the emergency shelters on Deck 12. While Hana coordinated the massive evacuation, June led security teams against the attackers. Through their bond, she could feel him moving through smoke-filled corridors, his tactical mind analyzing threats and protecting escape routes. The evacuation was nearly complete when everything went wrong for June. He had been leading a team of security officers through the lower decks, making sure all the escape routes stayed clear for the fleeing civilians. Through their mental link, Hana felt his focused determination as he moved from section to section, his tactical mind constantly calculating the best ways to protect innocent people. Then she felt the explosion that changed everything. A hidden bomb had been planted near the main evacuation corridor, timed to go off just as the largest group of families passed through. June saw the device's blinking lights a split second before it detonated. Without hesitation, he threw himself toward the explosive, using his own body to shield a group of children from the blast. The pain that hit Hana through their mental connection was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It felt like being struck by lightning, a sudden shock that left her gasping and disoriented. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't sense June's presence at all, and she feared the worst. "June!" she called out through their link, abandoning her coordination of the evacuation network to focus entirely on finding him. His response came back weak and fuzzy, like a radio signal fading in and out. "I'm alive," he managed to think back to her. "But I can't move. Something's wrong with my legs." Hana ran through the station's corridors faster than she had ever moved in her life, following their mental connection like a compass needle pointing toward its magnetic north. She found him in a damaged section of the lower deck, pinned under a fallen beam with several unconscious security officers scattered around him. His uniform was torn and bloody, and his left leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. But what struck her most was the expression on his face. For the first time since she had met him, Captain June looked vulnerable and afraid. "I can't feel my legs," he said quietly as she knelt beside him. "The blast must have damaged my spine. Hana, if I'm paralyzed, I won't be able to serve anymore. Being a soldier is all I know how to do." Seeing this strong, confident warrior reduced to such vulnerability awakened something protective in Hana that she hadn't known existed. With careful movements, she began checking his injuries, her gentle hands finding the damaged areas and assessing what could be treated immediately. "You're going to be fine," she said, with a certainty that surprised them both. "The medical bay has advanced healing technology, but right now I need to stop this bleeding and stabilize your injuries." As she worked, using torn pieces of fabric to bandage his wounds and speaking softly to keep him conscious, June watched her with growing amazement. This was the same woman who had barely been able to whisper during their first meeting. Now she was taking charge of a medical emergency with calm efficiency. "You've changed," he said weakly, his voice filled with wonder rather than pain. "When did you become so strong?" Hana paused in her bandaging to look directly into his eyes. "I learned it from you," she said simply. "But you're learning something from me too, aren't you?" June managed a small smile despite his injuries. "I'm learning that real strength isn't always about fighting and commanding. Watching you coordinate that evacuation, seeing how you connected with thousands of minds to save lives, that was more powerful than any weapon I've ever used." As they waited for the rescue teams to arrive, both of them made a conscious decision about their mental connection. What had begun as an accident was becoming something they both treasured. "When we get through this crisis," Hana said softly, "I want to keep our bond, not because we were forced together, but because we choose to be." June reached up with his uninjured hand to touch her face gently. "I've been thinking the same thing. We make each other better than we could ever be alone." 2 weeks after the second attack, June was back on his feet thanks to the station's advanced medical technology. The doctors had repaired the damage to his spine, though he still walked with a slight limp that reminded everyone of his sacrifice. More importantly, he and Hana had finally gathered enough evidence to expose the conspiracy that had been sabotaging the peace talks from the beginning. Evidence was damning and reached higher than anyone had imagined. High-ranking officials from the Human Defense Council, members of the Whisper Realm's own advisory board, and representatives from 3 other species had all been working together to ensure the negotiations failed. Their motivation was simple and ugly. War was profitable, and peace threatened their wealth and power. "We have communication records, financial transactions, and even recorded meetings," Hana explained, as she and June prepared their presentation for the emergency session. of the Galactic Council. But the hardest part will be convincing the Council that such widespread corruption is possible. The Grand Assembly Chamber was packed with representatives from dozens of worlds, journalists, and security personnel. This was the moment that would determine whether their investigation had been worth the risks they had taken. As they walked to the central podium together, Hannah felt the familiar flutter of nervousness, but it was different now. Instead of paralyzing fear, it was the natural tension that came before doing something important. June had insisted on using a walking stick rather than accepting a hoverchair, wanting to stand beside Hannah as she addressed the assembly. His presence radiated quiet support and strength, but he had made it clear that this was her moment to lead. Honored representatives, Hannah began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sound system. 2 weeks ago, many of you believed that radical extremists were responsible for the attacks on this station. Today, we're here to show you that the real enemy has been sitting among us all along. As she spoke, displaying evidence on the large screens around the chamber, Hannah felt her confidence growing with each word. Through her mental link with June, she drew upon his tactical clarity to organize her thoughts and his unwavering determination to push through any obstacles. The reaction from the audience was immediate and intense. Gasps of shock, angry muttering, and demands for more proof filled the air as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Several representatives stood up to challenge their findings, but Hannah was ready for them. "Councillor Vex of the Mining Guild," she said, addressing a large alien who had just accused them of fabricating evidence. "Your emotional state right now shows extreme anxiety and deception. You're not angry because our evidence is false. You're angry because it's true, and you're worried about being exposed yourself." The Mining Guild representative sat down quickly, his face changing color in a way that indicated embarrassment in his species. Other suspected conspirators in the audience began shifting uncomfortably as they realized that Hannah's telepathic abilities made it impossible for them to hide their guilt. June stepped forward slightly, not to take over, but to add his support to her words. "Princess Hannah has shown remarkable courage in uncovering this conspiracy," he said, his voice carrying respect rather than command. "But more than that, she's demonstrated something that should give us all hope for the future." He gestured toward Hannah with obvious pride. 2 weeks ago, our species barely understood each other. Today, we've worked together to expose a threat that could have destroyed any chance for peace. We've proven that our different strengths can complement each other perfectly." The chamber fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Here was a human military officer, openly acknowledging the leadership of an alien princess, while she drew strength from his support without being overshadowed by it. "The evidence speaks for itself," Hannah continued, her voice now strong and steady. "But what matters more is what we do next. We can let fear and suspicion divide us, or we can choose to build something better together." The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with intense discussions for 3 hours after Hannah and June presented their evidence. Representatives huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones as they processed the shocking revelations about the conspiracy. Some argued for immediate arrests, others demanded more investigation, and a few still seemed reluctant to believe that such widespread corruption was possible. Hannah stood quietly near the central podium, watching the debates with her newfound confidence intact. Through her telepathic abilities, she could sense the genuine emotions flowing through the chamber. Most of the representatives felt betrayed and angry about being manipulated, but there was also something else growing among them, hope for a real solution. June remained close beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. His leg was bothering him more than he let on, but he refused to sit down during such a crucial moment. Several times, worried delegates approached them with questions or concerns, and they handled each inquiry as a team, with Hannah's empathic insights complementing June's strategic thinking. Finally, the council's chief moderator called for order and asked Hannah to present her formal recommendations. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the chance to propose something that had never been tried before in galactic history. "Honored representatives," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "The attacks on this station have shown us 2 important truths. First, that there are those who profit from keeping us divided and afraid. But second, and more importantly, that different species can work together in ways that make us all stronger. She gestured toward June, who nodded encouragingly. Captain June and I have discovered that human determination, combined with telepathic sensitivity, creates abilities that neither of our species possesses alone. We propose taking this partnership and expanding it across the galaxy. A murmur of interest rippled through the assembly as delegates leaned forward to hear more details. Imagine human peacekeepers working alongside telepathic counselors, Hannah continued, her excitement growing as she shared her vision. Warriors who can protect innocent people, guided by empaths who can detect threats before violence erupts. Negotiators who combine human directness with alien sensitivity to resolve conflicts that have lasted for generations. An elderly representative from the crystal worlds raised her hand. Princess Hannah, such cooperation sounds wonderful in theory, but how do we know it can work on a large scale? Your partnership with Captain June seems to be unique. June stepped forward to answer, his military bearing commanding attention even as he spoke with newfound gentleness. With respect, Counselor, what makes our partnership work isn't some special accident. It's the willingness to learn from each other, and the recognition that our different strengths can complement rather than compete. He looked around the chamber, making eye contact with representatives from multiple species. Every human soldier I know joined the military to protect innocent people. Every telepathic being I've met wants to prevent unnecessary conflict. We're already working toward the same goals. We just need to start working together, instead of separately. Over the next several hours, they outlined a detailed plan for interspecies cooperation teams. Human military expertise would be paired with telepathic conflict resolution. Alien empathy would guide human strength. Different species would contribute their unique abilities to create something greater than any one group could achieve alone. The final vote wasn't even close. Representatives from 47 worlds approved the new alliance, with only 3 abstentions and no opposing votes. As the treaty was signed, Hannah and June stood together on the platform, their hands clasped in a gesture that had become a symbol of hope for millions of beings across the galaxy. You know what's amazing? Hannah whispered to June as they watched the historic signatures being added to the document. A month ago, I couldn't speak to one stranger without panicking. Today, I just convinced an entire galaxy to try something completely new. June squeezed her hand gently, his scarred face showing a pride that went far beyond military accomplishment. And I learned that the strongest thing a warrior can do is know when not to fight, and when to listen instead.